Good morning. I'm Matt Driskill, editor of Asian Aviation Magazine and AsianAviation.com. Welcome to the latest In Conversation, sponsored by Metrojet of Hong Kong. We are in conversation again with Conrad Clifford, one of our favorite guests. He was the first one on the show a long time ago, it seems. He was the Asia Pacific Regional Vice President for the International Air Transport Association, but he's now been named Deputy Director General, so he's off to Geneva, I guess, in a couple of months or so. Conrad, welcome back to In Conversation, and congratulations on the new job.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thank you.
We spoke in December. News of vaccines was breaking. Everybody was happy. 2021 was going to be a great year for aviation. I was ready to travel again. I wanted to go home for the summer for my usual French vacation with the in-laws. It hasn't quite worked out that way. Can you kind of give us a quick recap for the last 6 months for the industry, and what is the association's forecast for the rest of the year?
Yeah, well, I guess what nobody could have foreseen was the impact of the new variants, and that has really set us back very much on the year, and our expectations have had to change accordingly. In the month of April, globally, traffic was still down 65% comparing to pre-COVID levels, international traffic. We've seen some good recoveries in domestic markets, notably in China, in America. But really, it's the variants that have held back a number of other domestic markets. You'll have seen what happened with India from about February onwards, the second wave, a very, very tragic case. And that's really held back travel internationally as well. So some domestic market recovery, and we expect that to continue. But international is still very much limited.
And even the international that does happen, let's say the Trans-Tasman bubble, it starts, it stops, it gets suspended. We've had problems with outbreaks in Sydney and everything. My publisher is locked down in Sydney for the next couple of weeks. So, yeah. Even that doesn't help. One thing I really want to talk about, though, and I've been hammering on this in stories and viewpoints and different things like that. We talk about IATA has been very strenuous in its beliefs that you can't do quarantines. It's going to be the death of international aviation. People are not going to travel if they have to stay in a hotel for 14 days, can't go out, eat bad food, those kinds of things. So testing and health passports, digital, of course, has been all the rage. Commons Pass, IATA's Travel Pass. The problem that seems to be holding it back, standards. Now, are you going to be the go-to guy now at IATA that's going to hammer home to governments that they need to come up with, they need to agree to standards so that we can roll these out and get travel started again?
Yeah, we're certainly continuing to push for governments to follow the WHO SMART certificate guidelines, and also the testing certification guidelines from ICAO. So yes, we're absolutely pushing governments to follow those guidelines as closely as possible and try and come up with standards that are harmonized globally, because that will otherwise hold things up.
IATA has also talked about managing risk. You had mentioned something to me, I think, in one of our previous conversations, where the association has been dealing mainly with health ministers instead of transport ministers in dealing with COVID and the effects on the industry. Health ministers, obviously, they want 0 cases. We know that's not going to happen. We had Singapore the other day talk about that going forward, we're really going to need to manage things as COVID becomes endemic, so that you manage the risk, you test, you get people vaccinated, you track and trace, and those kinds of things. What is it going to take for government? And I know we've got the variants that are spreading really fast. Delta variant is now, and then Delta Plus, I think, is also out in the community. What is it going to take for governments to reach that conclusion and find a way to open borders?
So I think the real longer term solution is mass vaccination, because when you've got your society largely vaccinated, you don't feel the same levels of risk of importation of disease that you would feel if nobody's vaccinated, and you don't run that risk of having your health system overrun by another variant. So vaccination is really the key, and then followed with testing regimes. And this is where really we think our travel pass becomes very important, and other passes as well, so that governments can assure themselves of the health credentials of anybody coming into or leaving their country, and then they know what level of risks they're taking on. But I think the announcement from Singapore was absolutely right. It's no longer a pandemic in terms of being something that's going to go away. It's endemic. It's going to be here for the long term. So we have to find a way to get our populations safely vaccinated, and then in a very data-driven way to reopen our borders safely and securely.
I was listening. We're still on standards a little bit because it was interesting to me. I was listening to yet another webinar, which is what we have to do these days, talking about digital passports and versus paper documents, and the importance of going digital. Someone was saying that even if you have your negative PCR test, you have your vaccination records and all of that, all of these paper documents, that it took one traveler 5 hours to be processed at an airport, and then if travel does pick up, that it would take up to 8 hours to process one passenger. I mean, that's just going to be impossible for airports and airlines to handle.
Yeah, this is a study that we did in May, looking at the processing times, and you're right, they've more than doubled, even with the very few people that are traveling today. And you're quite right. If we get back to where we were pre-COVID, we're looking at 8 hours of processing for all that paper, and that's not going to be feasible, and it's not going to work in an airport environment at all. And this is why digital health certificates are so important, and why it's so important for governments to accept the digitization of this whole process. That's the paper process part of it, and the other part is the health aspect. So the more you can digitize, the more contactless you are, which makes for a healthier and safer environment as well for travelers.
It seems like, I mean, I know that IATA has been very vocal and been very good about pushing for the industry, pushing for governments to allow the industry to basically get back into business and get back in the air. But I saw something very interesting the other day in Great Britain. Groups were coming together, pushing back against quarantines, pushing back against border closures, saying that, we need to be able to get out. We need to be able to travel. Let us travel. And it was supported by several of the airlines there. But then again, we see the variants pop up in places like Australia, and it shuts down the Tasman bubble. Is there a right or a wrong here?
No, I don't think there is a right or a wrong, but obviously people travel, and if they've all been vaccinated and they've played their part, then I think increasingly they're expecting that governments should enable them to travel again, because they've been vaccinated, they've done the right thing, and now they'd like to travel again. So there is increasing pressure on government to reopen borders to these groups.
Okay. Conrad, need to take a quick break right here to hear from our sponsor, Metrojet of Hong Kong. We'll be right back after this.
We're going to have the crown jewels of Asia, and I promise you we're going to have the nicest and busiest business aviation hangar in the region.
And we're back. We're in conversation with Conrad Clifford, currently the Asia Pacific Regional Vice President for IATA. Although he is moving up the corporate ladder, he will be the Deputy Director General, I think starting in July. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And you'll be moving on to Geneva from Singapore.
I will, yes, yeah, indeed.
Okay. Switching gears for a minute, a week or so ago, and I was kind of curious as to why they all picked the same week to do it. There were companies like Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney, several others that were touting their environmental moves. They're going green. Again, I don't know why they all decided to do it in the same week, but it was interesting. We've got Corsia cutting CO2 emissions. I remember it was an anecdote, wasn't an anecdote, but I was at a press conference in, I think it was South Korea, at one of the general meetings. And and one of the well-known aviation correspondents was kind of giving your former Director General a hard time about calling the industry a major polluter. Why now is the industry really focused on going green? Why now?
I don't think it's anything new. I think we've always been focused on the green issue, and obviously we've been very busy dealing with COVID for in the recent past. But the expectation is that as we come out of COVID, the number one priority for the industry will be how to set a long-term goal moving towards net zero. So that's really and all of the passenger surveys that we've done still highlight the fact that this is a number one concern for travellers, how to overcome the issue of sustainability and flight.
Is now the time to do it? I mean, airlines are we've had several go into administration. They've laid off thousands of people, flight attendants, pilots, everybody else. I mean, can they afford to make these investments now?
The answer to that is that you have to start, and so I guess there's never a right time to start this kind of thing. And the sorts of investments that are being looked at are out over a long period. Our current target is to halve the levels of 2005 emissions by 2050. But more than 40 airlines, which comprise more than 40% of passengers carried around the world, have already moved towards a net zero by 2050 target. So it's something that we're discussing very much within the industry, and we're all looking to move towards a long-term target that is acceptable. So we have an ICAO General Assembly coming up next year. You may remember that it was at one of those General Assemblies that CORSIA was developed and agreed by 190 countries around the world. At the next assembly, they'll be looking for a long-term target for sustainability as well. So that's why it's really very much on the agenda for everybody within our industry at the moment.
Does the industry get an unfair reputation? I mean, I think the agreed upon figure, it's responsible for about 2% of global CO2 emissions. In the grand scheme of things, it doesn't seem like much. And you look at an industry like shipping with the use of bunker fuel, which is about the dirtiest fuel out there you can burn. Does aviation get an unfair? Do they get a bad rap?
I think everybody's got to play their part, and I think from the airline perspective, our main issue is it's not just airlines, it's everybody in our industry, and we all have to work together. So engine manufacturers, aircraft manufacturers, airports, ANSPs, the people that provide the air traffic control, everybody's got to do their bit, and we've got to reduce that down to a net zero. So that's what we're aiming towards.
I hate to sound like a cynic, although I am, but I read the other day that the tipping point for irreversible global warming may have already been triggered, according to scientists that are studying the Arctic and studying the Antarctic. And there was another report as well. I spent a lot of time reading reports lately. There was another report that said no matter what aviation does, it's likely that changes to engines, airframes, is actually going to have a negligible effect on pollution.
Well, so you mentioned the figure of 2% before. So I suppose in terms of bringing that from 2% down to zero, that I suppose one could say that's negligible. But nevertheless, it's a very important point. No, we've looked at the maths for this. We do think that the targets that were set to reduce global warming can still be achieved, and we want to play our part in making that happen.
What about hydrogen? Airbus has talked about hydrogen. They want to have a hydrogen fuel plane demonstrated by 2035. I was listening to a senior researcher from Pratt & Whitney the other day who said that really there's no way aviation can rely on hydrogen, because he said if you took all the hydrogen that was available in the world today, it would only power about 10% of the aircraft that are flying today. And that was all the hydrogen on the entire planet. And there's really right now producing clean hydrogen or green hydrogen is very difficult. So the hydrogen that does get produced is brown or dirty hydrogen. Is hydrogen just a dream?
So with our current target, which is, like I said earlier, 50% of 2005 levels by 2050, hydrogen isn't going to make a dent in that over that timescale. So hydrogen may be something for the longer term, but in terms of our immediate target, it doesn't really help. What really helps is sustainable aviation fuel. And what we want to see and what we need to see is infrastructure and technology that delivers SAF, as we call it, in quantities and costs that are achievable and offerable. And that will have the single biggest impact of any of the new technologies that are available at the moment. And the other thing to remember is that most of the problem is long-haul wide-body travel. And so if hydrogen aircraft are largely going to be short-haul or smaller within that sort of 2050 timeframe, it doesn't really help. But SAF helps. So that's where we're focusing, along with many other technological improvements.
A little bit of a personal question. How long have you been in Asia?
So this time around, 7 years.
7 years. Looking back over your time as the regional vice president for Asia Pacific, what have been your highlights, and what do you wish maybe you'd been able to do differently?
So some of the highlights, I think I built a house in Indonesia, and it's become my second home, which I'm very pleased about. So I've really come to love that country. And I think living in Singapore was a real privilege as well. An amazing modern city right at the heart of things. So I think I've been pretty lucky in terms of the places that I've lived and the cultures and the peoples that I've come into contact with. And of course, this for me was my sort of second time round. In a previous life, I was mostly centered around Hong Kong and Thailand. So it's been great to be in more Southeast Asia rather than sort of more northerly Asia.
And Geneva is going to be a big change from all of that. Let me ask you a question back on aviation. Is there a bright note out there? I always like to end these shows on a bright note if we've got one. What can we look forward to? Is there light at the end of the tunnel? Can I go to France? Can I go to France this summer and see my French in-laws?
I'm not sure about this summer, but we're certainly seeing traffic coming back in the northern hemisphere before the end of this year for sure. So that's all good news. And as we see the increasing levels of vaccination around the world, that also is good news. So it is definitely coming back. It's just a question of when. And I suppose there's always a question mark about, will there be new variants? But barring new variants, things are looking good. Finally.
Good to hear. Conrad Clifford, the new incoming Deputy Director General of IATA. Thanks for joining me in conversation. Good luck in Geneva.
Thanks, Matt.